I I will be recording this PowerPoint, so if you have questions, you can always come back to it and reference. Once again, my name is Cassie Anderson. I am the Master Gardener Coordinator in Adams County, and I'm here today to talk to you about everybody's very favorite subject, I'm sure, weeds. I will be upfront. Most of the weeds in this talk are pictures from my own yard, so I'm certainly not immune to the complications and problems that weeds have. They are a beast for all of us to try and fight against, and it's a battle that's always ongoing. Generally speaking, weeds, by their most basic definition, are simply a plant that is growing where you don't want it. Some of them might be plants that other people see as really, really beneficial. Some people may see them as the worst, the bane of their existence, and you don't mind them. But generally speaking, the weeds I'm going to be talking about are those that most of us don't want in our yards. So to start off, generally speaking, weeds are a problem in our gardens. They can become overwhelming if we don't stay on top of them. And sometimes it's hard to do. We all, even in the time of COVID, we all have busy lives. We all have lots of things that we're doing. But it can be really important to go out and several times a week monitor your garden, see what things are coming in, and keep on top of it. It's a lot easier to pull weeds when they're small rather than when they're really large. And it's hard to do. I certainly let my weeds get larger than they should far too often. And another point when you're wanting to make sure that your weeds are coming out easily, the better you keep them watered, the better you're going to do. This applies not only for getting them pulled out, it also applies if you're applying herbicides. In this talk, I will be talking about herbicides. I will be talking about various pesticides that you can apply. Mostly, I'm just trying to give you all of the information that you can have to make your own decision. I'll be giving you pesticide options as well as non-pesticide options for getting rid of most of the weeds that we'll talk about. So it's totally up to you. I just like to know that you have all of the options that you can in your resource kit. So it will make it so that you can make the best decision for your yard and for your situation. Generally speaking, when we're thinking about weeds, prevention is going to be a much better solution than coming in on the back end and fighting back with the weeds. So there's a lot of things you can do to prevent weeds becoming an overwhelming force. You can mulch the area. Mulches can vary from a wood chip on a perennial bed, a grass or straw mulch in your vegetable bed. Plastic mulches have some level of applications, which I'm not going to have time to get into today, but you can do plastic mulches to kill the ground or the weed seed in an area. It's called solarization. Some vegetable gardeners use various plastic mulches that can have benefits for insects, that can have soil warming properties and help with weeds. But there's a lot of different things that you can do to help reduce how many weeds you have on the soil surface. It's also important when you're planning your garden, when you're working with your garden, to avoid bringing in weedy material. Any mulch, compost, topsoil can all carry weed seed. I know when I was growing up, we got a delivery of manure from a friend of ours, and we didn't realize that it was uncomposted manure, and we were fighting back prickly lettuce and weeds for years as a consequence of that weedy manure that we got. So it's important to think about what you're bringing into your garden and make sure that it doesn't bring a whole barrel of weeds in with it. And seed mixes can be weedy too. I got a wildflower seed mix 2 years ago and put it in a bed of mine, and pretty much all that came up from that seed mix were nightshades, weedy nightshades, and red root pigweed, which I'm still fighting back. And I think I had like 3 wildflowers come out of the whole thing. So it can be a complication if you're even what you're buying. So make sure that you're buying from reputable sources. All seed companies are required to tell you if they do a seed mix, if there is any mixture of weed seed in the mix itself. So that's a good thing to take note of. When you're thinking about starting a new area or working a new area, be aware that tilling a space, if it's weedy or if it has had a history of weeds, is going to cause a lot more problems than they solve. And so you can disturb a lot of the seed that might be just under the soil surface. You can have a lot of things germinating that might not have been there before. Or if you've got something like bindweed, which spreads through its root systems, you might chop up that root system, not into small enough pieces to kill it, but into pieces where you suddenly have a lot more. Another great way to prevent weeds in your yard is to install things like drip irrigation. Rather than doing a broadcast sprinkler, then you can water only what you need for your specific purposes. And that's going to focus where the water is, where the moisture is, and help reduce weeds elsewhere. All right, as we get started, a little bit of terminology. We've got, I will talk about our weeds as if they are annual, as if they are perennial, if they have fibrous or tap roots, they spread via seeds more or via roots more, and all of these kind of influence how you are going to control your weeds. So an annual is kind of what it sounds like. It's a plant that starts from seed each year and completes its entire life cycle that year and does not come back the next year. Perennials are those that have a root system that is established, and perennials can be woody perennials or they can be herbaceous perennials, which means they die back to the ground. And they have a very different root system, and they complete a flower cycle through the year, but their life cycle is over the course of many, many years. And of course, if a weed is more likely to spread via seed or via roots, then it's more important to know how you're going to manage if it going to seed or its root system spreading. So it's important to kind of understand some of the differences between your plants as you're working on how to manage them. All right, so now we're going to get into the meat of it. The vast majority of weed questions that we get are around bindweed and Canada thistle. So those are the two I'm going to spend the most time on today. Plenty of other weeds that are important, but bindweed and Canada thistle are two of the most difficult to eradicate and two of the most prevalent in a lot of our backyard gardens or front yard gardens. So bindweed. One of the big proponents of controlling bindweed is to wear it out. Bindweed is one of the most persistent weeds in the garden. They are large, they are cumbersome. It's not easy to manage with any one management method. This is one that often putting in kind of a multiple pronged approach is going to do a lot better for you in the long term. If you pull it young, pull it often, or cut it young, or spray it young and spray it often, that's going to be your best approach. Bindweed has roots that can get up to 20 feet long. This was actually a picture I took this week weeding my vegetable garden. This one this root was just coiled up in the ground. It just kind of pulled right out. The more of the root system that you can pull out and dig out and cut out, if you are pulling, the better control you're going to get in the long term. Bindweed can store a lot of energy in its root system. I've seen some bindweed roots that almost look woody, and they are large and thick, and these are the deep ones that we often don't see. So the more frequently you can pull, the more frequently you can get the energy out of the system, the better control you're going to get overall on the bindweed itself. So if you're looking at control options, you can go conventional or you can go organic. If you're looking at conventional control, there are some caveats. 2,4-D is a pretty good control if applied several times on bindweed, but it's one that you don't want to apply in the heat of the season. If it's over 80, 85 degrees, even in the next 24 hours, you really don't want to be putting 2,4-D onto anything because it can do what we call volatilize. It can become problematic for our other broadleaf plants. And so it's not a good choice if it's hot, but in the shoulder seasons, especially in spring and in fall, you can be pretty safe applying it. Quinclorac is a chemical that is pretty effective on bindweed. It's rated for use in the lawns, but you can paint it on specific bindweed if you've got bindweed in other areas as well. And glyphosate, you'll see me referencing glyphosate in quite a few of these, is a systemic herbicide that will kill everything. And so it's one to be very careful with if you're applying in areas where you've got plants that you want, desirable plants, because it's just going to kill them all. And 2,4-D and quinclorac will kill other broadleaf plants. So make sure if you are going to apply any of these herbicides that you apply them reading the label in the appropriate conditions, wearing the appropriate protective gear, that kind of thing. And be aware that with bindweed in particular, one treatment is not going to get rid of this thing. It's going to be a repeated treatment. It's going to be a repeated application of a lot of different things. If you want to go the organic route, which also works, but could be a little bit more work, especially with bindweed, mostly you're looking at what we call burn down agents. We're looking at things that will kill the top, and over time, the more you kill the top, the more you will wear out the root system, and eventually you will kill the plant overall. So you can use something like an herbicidal vinegar. Herbicidal vinegars is like a 20% solution, whereas if you're buying grocery store vinegar, it's like 5%. So you do have to be very cautious when you're applying it. It's something that you absolutely cannot get on your skin. You probably want to wear glasses if you're applying it because it can be pretty caustic. If you have an area that's safe, I actually did this in an area in my yard this year that was completely bare with nothing around that could catch fire. You can do some burning if you have weed seed or bindweed seed on the surface that you don't want to start germinating. You can use a burner and you can burn back, but you do, once again, we live in Colorado, it's a dry state. You want to be very cautious if you're using a burning as your control, as one of your control agents. Burning is not going to actually kill your bindweed, but it's one of the many things that you can do to help reduce its population and reduce how it goes. Ironically, boiling water is also going to work pretty well, but if you've got a large area, then that's a lot of water to boil, and it is just going to kill the top of the plant. It's not going to kill the root, so you'll have to do repeat applications. And that's the same with a lot of the other organic weed killer products you can get that are burn down agents like a clove or a citrus oil. They are going to kill the top part of the plant, but the root system will remain alive and the bindweed will grow back. So you'll just need to do repeated applications. I think there's a theme here. I put it on every slide on the bindweed. Wear it out. It's the best thing you can do is just persist, wear it out. If you can get out there every 1 to 3 days, multiple times a week at the very least, and pull it out, that's going to give you a lot better control than if you go out there once a month or a couple times a year. Anytime that you get those leaves that have matured and they're nice and big, they're collecting sun and able to kind of feed back into their root system and start the roots growing and reestablishing their energies. So the theme of bindweed is really just wear it out. A lot of you may have heard of a biocontrol option for bindweed. There definitely is one. It's a little mite called the bindweed mite, and it is effective with some caveats. If your area is unirrigated, if you reapply it and mow frequently, and especially if you have a large area like a field or a pasture, that's going to be the places in which the bindweed mite will be really successful for you. Unfortunately, in an irrigated backyard setting, the bindweed mites just aren't going to keep up with the growth that the bindweed can have. And so it's not usually going to be the best choice in a larger application. All right, so that was bindweed. Bindweed is definitely one of the biggest ones that we get questions on. And so hopefully that helps give you a little bit better idea how to manage bindweed. We'll move on to Canada thistle. Canada thistle is another difficult and persistent weed. It is also a perennial. It has deep spreading roots, not quite as deep as bindweed, but it can go many feet down. I've definitely heard 8 feet. And it spreads through its roots. So this isn't one that if you just control the seed spread, you will control the thistle and you'll be done and on your way, unfortunately. This is another one. If you can wear it out, then you can get some effective control. Mowing in larger spaces can actually be pretty effective for controlling this guy. If you can take something sharp and cut it right at the soil surface, you're wearing out its ability to feed back into its root system, and that can be an effective way to control the Canada thistle. Definitely, it's not going to be a one and done fight on the Canada thistle. If you're looking for chemical controls, you can get 2,4-D. You can also use glyphosate. For both of these, those same cautions apply. For 2,4-D, you want to make sure that you're applying it on a cool day that doesn't have a lot of wind. For glyphosate, you want to make sure that you are applying it just to the plant itself and not to other plants, because glyphosate will kill any of the surrounding plants as well. In terms of organic controls, you also have those burn down agents, the clove and citrus oil, the herbicidal vinegar, and you could use something like boiling water as well. I forgot to mention, if you have it in your lawn, or if you have it somewhere where you can outcompete, this is a good one to be outcompeted by plants that will overshade it. So if it's in your lawn, for example, if you mow and make sure that your lawn is well fertilized and that you have a nice dense stand of your lawn, then you're going to have a lot better success in controlling it in the long term. There are also some good biocontrol options for this. There are a few insects that have limited control, but the Palisade insectary, which I did just link to on our Facebook page, does have a fungus that is showing to have some pretty good control on Canada thistle, and that is something that's available to homeowners to purchase. One note, if you are ever using biocontrols, the biocontrols are never going to eliminate their host. They still want to have something to feed on, whether it's insects or a fungus or something, or any of those. They are going to want something to feed on. And so you're not going to get complete eradication. What they do is they slow it down. They might prevent the flowers from forming effectively, so you don't get as much reseeding, or they might just make the whole plant look a little bit stunted and a little bit sad. If you look at the CDA's Facebook page, which I shared to our Facebook page, has some really good pictures of the rust actually establishing on the Canada thistle. And the plants look yellow, they look unhealthy, they're smaller, and so it can be a pretty effective way to actually control these guys. All right, moving on to our next fairly common garden weed. Many of you have probably seen this. It has a lot of different names. I actually grew up calling it cheese wheel. It has a flower that kind of looks like a wheel of cheese. Problem with common names, there are a lot of them, and they can be confusing and different in different regional areas. I didn't put scientific names in any of this just because this is a quick, brief intro, but if you're interested, we can definitely let you know scientific names as well. Common mallow is one that, if you get on top of it in time, it's not a bad weed to manage, but it is a perennial. It does have a very deep taproot. And so once it gets large, once it gets established, it can be very, very difficult to eliminate. When it's young, you can pop it out. It'll have a little taproot that's maybe 3 to 6 inches long, and you can pull it out with just a garden shovel, or I like to use a hori-hori when I'm weeding. They pull out really easily. Once it gets to the point where the taproot is 8+ inches deep, then you're looking at having to dig it out with a shovel, and it starts to get pretty big pretty quickly. If you have a really established growth of these and you want to get rid of them, we had a master gardener who has a field that is rife with these guys, and she did actually go with a systemic broadleaf herbicide just to get them gone, and so that she could actually overplant successfully in the area, because it was beyond her and her husband's ability to dig it out manually. They spent a whole season trying. But there are some herbicides that you can get. If this is something that you've got a large stand of, you can email us and let us know that you're fighting a big battle. But for most people, this is one that you can remove yourself by hand with relatively little ease, provided you get it earlier in the season. All right, purslane. This is an annual, our first annual that we'll talk about, and so it's relatively easy to pull. It has a lot of annuals have much smaller root systems. They don't have to establish from year to year. They just have to get enough of their roots into the ground to get growing and to get large, or to reproduce for the season. So if you catch them early, they're relatively easy to manage. One benefit on these guys, they are edible. You can actually buy purslane seeds for planting. It's a little bit of an interesting taste. If you like okra, then purslane might be something that you want to add to your diet. It's not one that a lot of people really, really love. Don't do as I do. That picture I took this week as well. Don't let it go to flower, because the seeds follow very, very quickly after the flower. And a single plant can produce up to 250,000 seeds. I don't know about you, but that's a lot of seeds, and they're way too small for us to see. They're very, very tiny little black seeds, and they stay viable for a long time. So if you get one of these and it goes to seed, it could pollinate much of your garden pretty quickly. So pop those out as soon as you can get them. Like I said, the root systems are so shallow. They're so easy to pull out. Generally speaking, this is one that you should be able to rogue out yourself. You're probably not going to need much in the way of herbicides on these ones. All right, lamb's quarters, another annual, also edible, but usually when it's much smaller. I used to work at a small organic farm in the summers and when I was in college, and this would be what I would snack on while I was weeding other things. But it gets pretty bitter and tough as it gets older. Control on these ones is most effective when you just pull young seedlings. It's one that's really easy to manage. You can usually recognize it because it has this kind of grayish green, dusty coating on the leaves, and then these fairly distinctive leaf shapes. If you do have a larger area of this that's established, then you could use a systemic herbicide such as glyphosate to knock the population back. Really with these ones, since it's an annual, you're just looking to stop that seed production, make sure it doesn't go to flower so that you don't keep that cycle going. All right, curly dock. This is another one of those deep tap-rooted perennials. This is one that if you can get it out, the sooner that you can get it out, the better. The taproots, I've dug a few out. We had a lot of these in my yard when I moved in, and we dug a few out. We dug 18 inches down, and there was still root going further down from there. So they have very, very deep taproots, and they can be really big too. They're kind of like a giant carrot, but unfortunately not edible. The seed on these guys remains viable for over 80 years, and in good years, they can push 2 flushes of seeds. And on the right-hand picture here, you can see how many hundreds of thousands of seeds are on one plant alone. So this is one that you can definitely dig it out with a shovel. The nice thing about this is they're really big leaves. If you can catch it in this early stage in the left picture, then it's pretty easy to get the majority of the plant and the root out. Since it is a perennial, you have this little leaf stage for a few years before it gets to this gnarly giant stage on the right. If you have large infested areas, then you can use chemical controls such as 2,4-D and glyphosate with those previous security or cautions that I noted earlier on, that 2,4-D shouldn't apply when it's over 85 degrees, and glyphosate will kill anything else that it comes into contact with. So it's definitely use them with caution, and only if you need to, if you don't have if you have too many to effectively dig out by hand. All right, kochia. Kochia is an annual plant. This becomes one of the plants that turns into what we know of as tumbleweed. Kochia, when it's young, in this top picture, it almost creates kind of a carpet or lawn appearance. And so sometimes it's really easy to think, oh, this isn't so bad. It's nice, it's pretty, but it will get big, it will get woodier, and then it starts to, if it actually gets to the tumbleweed phase, then it will spread its seeds all over the place. This one is really easy to remove by hand pulling. It has a very small and delicate root system. It pops up without almost any effort. So that's probably the very best way to manage it if you have this in your yard. Most effective herbicide controls are not generally available for homeowners without a license. These plants do have a little bit of resistance to herbicides like glyphosate, but if you catch it when it's really young, if you really just want it gone, you can do a glyphosate. And if you have further questions on that, you can definitely get in touch with us and we can give you more details. But generally speaking, this one's pretty easy just to rogue out by hand. All right, everybody's garden favorite. When I talk about the fact that one person's weeds are another person's this is fine, dandelion definitely fits that category. Dandelion is generally it is a perennial. It does have a fairly deep taproot. And generally, it's going to be more problematic in areas with low fertility, and it's going to be less common in vegetable gardens. So if you are looking to manage dandelions, don't let it go to seed. I'm sure you're sensing a theme here for most of these weeds. If the flower has already started to close up a little bit, and you just pop it off thinking, oh, that's good, that's going to give me control, the dandelion flower will continue to mature through to the seed head point. So if you're going to pop the flowers off as a way of control, then just put them straight into either a community compost system or into your trash. Our backyard compost systems are not going to get hot enough generally to actually kill those weed seeds. One thing that's really good for dandelion control is to mulch your areas. So if you've got dandelion issues, those seeds are really sensitive to light. If they are shaded out, they're not going to germinate. And you can definitely control these with herbicides such as 2,4-D or glyphosate, just with those aforementioned notes of making sure that you're applying in appropriate ways. Oh, I had a second slide, I forgot. Okay. So if you want to control with chemicals, like I said, 2,4-D or glyphosate. If you want to go with organic controls, herbicidal vinegar, with the caution that herbicidal vinegar is pretty nasty stuff. Boiling water, I know some folks who just pop it out on their, especially if they've got things like dandelions in their driveway cracks or along the edge of the driveway. Boiling water can be a really good way to manage it in those areas. Or you can do things like the burn down agents, like a clove or a citrus oil. Dandelion is one of those that sometimes I do have the conversation, if you've just got a few of them, can you possibly live with it and pull those flowers before they really reseed your lawn? And they can be a really nice source of pollen for your early bees, something to consider if that's a direction that you want to go with your lawn. All right. Cheatgrass, also known as downy brome. This is a very invasive annual. It's been wreaking havoc across the Intermountain West. It's gotten into a lot of rangeland, a lot of open pasture areas, but in the backyard setting, it's pretty easy to manage. It is an annual, so it has that really small, easy to pull root system, and you can pull it in the backyard. Make sure that you pull it in mid-May. In this picture here, you can see that the seed head is starting to brown. At that point, it's pretty much mature and you're going to get reseeding from it. So it's one that you want to catch early. These are what we call a winter annual. Instead of a summer annual, they germinate very early in the year. If you do catch the plants when they're really, really young, you can till them in. So if you have them in your vegetable garden, if you catch them before they even start setting their seed heads, then you can till them right in. Just gives you some more organic material. Most of the herbicides that are going to be effective for homeowners are going to be effective are not rated for homeowner use. But if you do spray it with some glyphosate very early in the cycle, then you can get some control at that point. But that's going to be pretty early in the cycle, back in April, very early May, for most areas. All right. Red root pigweed. This is another annual weed, so it's pretty easy to pull. It's really easy to identify. It has this very characteristic red stem. That usually the red stem starts just around the soil level or just above the soil level. This does actually look very similar to some of our desirable crops that might reseed as well. I was looking for the red root pigweed in my yard to take this top picture for you all, and I kept looking at tomatillos that had reseeded and wondering why the stem wasn't red, and then I made the connection that it was tomatillo and it was not red root pigweed. This is another one that you definitely want to pull it before the flowers develop. This is in the amaranth family. If you've ever seen an amaranth plant, this makes seeds very similar. It makes thousands and thousands of seeds. So once it goes to seed, you're very likely to have a ton of seed, and it can be a little bit harder to get rid of them. So if you pull it, and this is one, herbicides probably aren't really warranted unless you have a major infestation of them. Generally speaking, you can pull these out. I mean, just a finger and a light touch, they pop right out of the ground. All right, and one of my favorites, sort of, in the garden, buffalo burr. This is another annual. It looks kind of like a tomato or a potato, but with spines. It's very easy to weed this guy, but you want to do it early in the spring, before those spines or the plant itself gets really large. You can use any of the organic controls that we've talked about, or chemical controls such as the glyphosate, but generally these are not, I've not ever seen these overrunning a garden. So it's definitely one that you'll want to kind of get ahead of in the early season, and very rarely this one's, as I said, it's an annual, so it pops up in this early season. Once you pull it, you're done with it for the year. So it's a fairly easy one to manage. All right, and I think, yep, that was the last weed that I have, and so I'm happy now to take a few questions. I see a question on how do you use clove and citrus oils? Are they mixed with water, sprayed? So since CSU Extension doesn't endorse particular products, I'm not referencing particular product names. A lot of organic weed control products, clove and citrus oils are going to be really, really prominent parts of the ingredients in organic weed controls. All right, what about goat heads? Goat heads are going to be another annual, so that's going to be one that if you can get control of it before it goes to seed, then it's going to help out. If you have a lot of it in your yard, I have heard that you can use like an old piece of carpet and put it down upside down and pull it up, and it will catch a lot of those nasty seeds. I don't have any of the specific chemicals for controlling it on the top of my head. I was mostly focusing on things that we see in a vegetable garden or in a perennial garden. Best control for prostrate knotweed, is it annual or perennial? It's not one that I looked into recently for this talk. I believe it's a perennial, but shoot me an email and I can get you a lot more information on that one. My email is on the screen at the moment. What about pine cones for mulch? What are advantages or disadvantages? So if you have enough pine cones to create a 3 to 4 inch deep mulch, go for it, but you might want to chip it up so that it's not really big pieces. I wouldn't say that there's any disadvantages beyond if you can get enough of them. Okay, another question for puncture vine or goat's head. It depends how you're battling it. If you're battling it in small acreage, then there are different recommendations, and I can direct you to our small acreage coordinator. Otherwise, if it's in the yard, like I said, making sure it doesn't go to seed and getting rid of it via not letting it go to seed is going to be a good direction to go. What about aspen runners? I'm guessing you mean aspen suckers. Aspen suckers, if you're trying to keep the adult trees alive, there's not much you can do besides digging those out with a shovel prune right where they're suckering up in the lawn. Any kind of systemic herbicides are going to affect the mother plant or the parent plant. What type of mulch is best for a vegetable garden? Generally speaking, for a vegetable garden, mulches are going to be much better if you're using a straw, a hay, or like grass clippings from your yard. They're going to be much better at, if you accidentally turn some of them in, it's not going to be as problematic over time. Wood chips are not one that we recommend generally for a vegetable garden. How do you minimize weeds before they get started? Maybe you might not have seen my early slide. Mulches and making sure that you have a good canopy, that your plants are planted fairly closely, are going to be pretty effective. So it's prevention before. If you do have an area that you know you're not going to be planting seeds in, you can also use a pre-emergent if you do know that you have a lot of weed seed in an area. Do you have any recommendation for cleavers or plantain? Plantain is one that I don't see much in areas that have good nutrients, so that's probably going to be a little bit trickier. Cleavers I'm not familiar with, and I know I'm familiar with the plant, but I'm not familiar with its control. That's one you could definitely shoot me an email and we can try and get in a little bit of a little bit more detail. I was in a few minutes late. Did you touch on thistle or bindweed? I did, yes, and we are going to be recording this, so you can pop back in and see what I said on those. I went into quite a bit of detail for bindweed and for Canada thistle. Where do you buy herbicidal vinegar? You can definitely get it online, and I think some nurseries might stock it. I'm not sure if the big box stores do or not. I'm using a Fiskar 4-claw for the first time. Is this an effective tool? I'm actually not familiar with that as a tool, but I would imagine if it's designed for weeding, it's probably a pretty good. What about hoeing and leaving weed material in the garden? If there are no flowers or seed heads, yeah, that's a great thing you can do. You can definitely leave your weed material in as long as there are no flowers and no seeds. Purslane is obnoxious in my garden. I have mulch. I move aside, pull the plants out, and put back in place. They are prolific. Yes, they definitely are prolific. I mean, when I was researching this talk, I knew that they made thousands of seeds. I didn't realize it was as many as 250,000. So that definitely sounds like you're doing it exactly right. The more you pull it out, make sure you pull it out before those flowers go to seed. What do you do if you're creating a new flower bed and need to till the earth? Should you remove the topsoil and grass or till under? How to prevent weeds from the tilling? So there's a couple different ways you could go about. You can kill the entire area with something like a glyphosate and then till the area in. Just be aware that you will get some kind of weed germination, very likely, unless you live in a pristine world where you have no weed seed in your yard, which if you do, I want to live where you live. There's a couple different routes you can go. You could water it and see what pops up and then spray that down. Or you can do what we call solarizing. You can get a UV resistant clear plastic from a greenhouse supply company, and you can solarize the area for 4 to 6 weeks. I think I already answered aspen runners, suckers. You'll just have to prune them out. Will any of these weeds reroot if they are left on the lawn once pulled? Generally speaking, if they are completely off the soil, then they will probably just desiccate. We live in a dry enough environment. If you are pulling them out with clumps of soil, then there's a chance that they might. But the only one I'm thinking that might would be bindweed. And so that one might just be good candidate. I tend to put all my bindweed in a big bucket and then I throw it into the chicken coop, and if the chickens get hungry enough, then they like the bindweed. It's not their preference. Purslane is their preference. If the bindweed roots are already woody, is the best method to still keep digging them out? Yes. Those woody roots, the more you can get those out, that's good carbohydrate storage that you are stealing from those evil bindweed weeds. So definitely a good thing to do. Bindweed, yes, it has the little flowers that look like morning glory flowers. Let me pop out of the, oh, I was about to pull up the picture, except I accidentally closed my PowerPoint instead of Yes, let me pull up the picture of it flowering. So yes, that is the bindweed flower in that picture. Okay. Can I do section on pests in the garden? We can definitely look into doing pests in the garden. I know we've got a lot going up on our Grow and Give website as well. So that could be another way for you to see. All right. Just try and get to the end, back to the end of the talk. Okay, how do you get rid of ash tree saplings? So the nice thing about ash tree saplings is if you make sure that your ash tree, or let's see, the ash tree saplings, they're not connected to any roots, so you can just dig them out as much as you want. Thoughts on hoary cress? That's not one that we get as many questions on. If you shoot me an email, I can give you a lot better answers. Can you use salt to prevent regrowth in an area you don't plan to grow anything? Even if you're not planning to grow anything there, I really wouldn't recommend it just because it does stick around for a long time and it will cause problems. It could cause problems down the line should you change your mind. Another question for insects, we could try and do an insect one in the future. I've been battling tall phlox for years. Any tips on management? Phlox is a perennial, so that's really one that you're going to have to get as much of the root system out as much as possible. And you could also try something like a glyphosate if you're willing to go that route. Virginia creeper. Oh, Virginia creeper is definitely an invasive one. Ironically, not a weed, but like I said, weed is in the eye of the beholder. So Virginia creeper is going to be one that if you don't want to use a herbicide, then you'll just need to keep cutting it back, wear the root system out, just like you would with bindweed or with the Canada thistle. If you're using glyphosate, how long does it stay in the soil? How long before the sprayed area can be planted? One of the reasons we do recommend glyphosate as much as we do is because it doesn't stay in the soil for very long. It's bound up in the soil and is not active within a day or two. And usually you can plant the area as long as it's sprayed just with glyphosate. You can usually plant within a few days. It's a pretty quick turnaround. A lot of glyphosate products such as Roundup have secondary products in them, so you just want to be sure that you read the label carefully to see what the label itself says about the product. Yes, Japanese beetle, they definitely love Virginia creeper. I have woody shrubs and vines coming in from my neighbor's yard into my vegetable garden. How do I keep them out without killing the whole plant? If it's coming from a neighbor, you're probably just going to have to keep on cutting them back, or talk to your neighbor and see if you guys can come to some kind of arrangement for it. How do you get rid of Siberian elm? Siberian elm is a weedy tree, definitely. Persistent cutting or use some kind of herbicide. There's I think it's called Shrub-X, triclopyr, could be effective for really getting rid of it. Is there a ground cover that will push out weeds or will outcompete? A really healthy lawn will outcompete most of these weeds. If you fertilize and water effectively, then that can outcompete weeds. Some other ones, I see sometimes Delosperma or ice plant can get pretty dense, and if it's healthy, it will outcompete to a certain degree. But I mean, nothing is 100%. If you're using grass clippings as mulch, how do you make sure that it has no weed seeds in it? That's going to be one you want to mow your lawn before your weeds go to seed. If you're mowing your lawn fairly frequently, then you should be pretty safe. But if you've got weeds weed seeds in it, then it might not be the best choice to put into your garden. Siberian elm control. All right, I guess we should do something on Siberian elm control. All right. Yes, we are recording this talk. I have a problem with red stem fillery, common stork's bill. So that's going to be another plant that really, if you can, actually, now I started to say it's an annual, but now I'm thinking it has a taproot, and I'm not 100% certain it's annual or perennial, but it is a winter annual, so it blooms pretty early in the season. It's going to be, you'll want to make sure that you don't let it go to seed, that you either dig it or burn it down. It could, I still think it is an annual. If you burn it down before it goes to seed, either with a conventional herbicide or an organic herbicide, then you're going to be able to get on top of it pretty decently. How long does glyphosate last? If it is just the active ingredient glyphosate, it's just a day or two. And so you really don't have to wait very long. Stork's bill. I just answered the stork's bill a little bit, but if you have more questions on stork's bill, I can definitely send you some information. Herbicides like Weed B Gon for weeds on lawn. So the active ingredient, I believe, in Weed B Gon is 2,4-D, and so it is one that you just want to read the label and you want to use appropriately according to the instructions on the label. Usually they have listed on there how long you have to wait before you want to go back into the area. Is there a website with these and other weeds with this information? Yes, the CSU Extension fact sheet website. We've got a ton of information on a lot of these weeds and many, many more. Yes, glyphosate has been determined to be carcinogenic, but a lot of that decision was determined by a citizen group, not by scientists. If you're using it appropriately, then it should be relatively safe for you. What about using baking soda in an area you don't want any growth? Baking soda, as far as I know, isn't going to be killing much. Increasing resources for pollinators and honeybees. If you're asking for a class on pollinators in the garden, I actually did one. It's on our YouTube page. You can check that out, but we might do something else later in the season as well. Is there an herbicide that can kill ash tree saplings? Pulling them out isn't feasible. Glyphosate would do it, definitely. Controls for sumac saplings. Sumac, that's another one that those are suckers. They're connected to the parent plant, so it's definitely one that you want to be cautious about applying herbicides, otherwise rogue it out with a shovel. Suggestions for weeding tools. My favorite two tools are a hori-hori, which is essentially like a really sharp knife, and a stirrup hoe. Stirrup hoe is really good for early season weeding. What can I apply to my veggie garden to expedite growth? Generally speaking, that's going to be nitrogen, but you want to make sure that you're doing it at appropriate levels. Oh, mint is overrunning my garden. Mint is definitely one I always suggest to people to plant in a pot or a container because that's what mint does. You'll definitely want to make sure that you cut it back with a shovel. If you want to keep it in the ground, you'll just have to keep cutting it back with a shovel, or you can do some kind of burn down agent for the areas that you don't want it. You don't want to use a systemic herbicide like 2,4-D or like glyphosate because it could kill the entire thing. We were going to try the mites for bindweed. The garden is irrigated. It won't. So if you have a large field, it might work in your large field, but if it's in your garden, it's likely that the mites are not going to be able to keep up. Connie, can you send a picture to my email or to the Master Gardener email and we can try and identify what you've got? Let's see. Another question on salting a driveway. Salting is definitely just not something that we recommend. If you do have a lot of weeds growing up in your driveway, you could add more gravel, make it a little bit thicker, and you can also make sure that you could put some kind of longer lasting herbicide, provided that you know that you don't have anything surrounding. You can get in touch with us and we can give you a little bit more detail as well. Can you smother the weeds with plastic or newspaper and mulch, or will the roots remain alive? Yes, you can, depending on what else you're growing in the area. We generally don't, there's not much, so if you're doing like a newspaper and then some mulch on top, that's really going to help with new weeds. If you have really well established weeds, it's probably not going to do a lot and they'll just kind of grow through it. Somebody else said that they have a similar weeder to the one that was referenced before. They wouldn't heartily recommend it. It gets young dandelions and other taproot weeds out, but doesn't get out large, deep roots or weeds with burst roots. Oh, good. Somebody's hopeful they might get their yard and garden back. Yes, it's definitely can be tricky. A little bit more about solarization. One sec. I also need to launch the poll. There we go. I did just launch a poll. If you guys don't mind responding to that while we're getting through questions. Actually, I think we're almost through the questions. Yes, if you don't mind answering the poll, what is the best herbicide with small dogs? So Carol, that's going to be where I do the typical extension answer of it depends. Definitely that's going to need to be a larger conversation of where are you spraying it, what are you trying to control, what is your end goal, all of that. So if you want to shoot me an email, that might be an easier way to get that answered. All right, and then can you tell us a little bit more about solarization? So solarization is essentially we create a little bit of a greenhouse on the ground. And you do that by using a UV resistant clear plastic. You can't just use the painter's tarps from Home Depot. I've done this. The plastic becomes brittle in our intense UV and actually shatters. And if you want your neighbors to think you're crazy, if you have to go out into your yard and vacuum, because that's the only way to get up all the bits of plastic, then that's a very good way to do it. But if you can get a UV resistant plastic, you put that out usually for at least 6 weeks, then it actually heats up hot enough underneath that clear plastic to kill the weed seed. Generally speaking, you don't then want to go and till it all up again unless you're planning to resolarize, because you're going to turn up more weed seed as well. And so it can be a really effective way to kill out an area, especially if you don't want to use herbicides. All right. Yes, I will write down my favorite tools. Hori Hori and a stirrup hoe. They are definitely probably the most effective, although I end up just grubbing things out. Solarization, yes, it does affect roots. So depending how long you leave it on, I know my mother bought a house here and we put one on for the whole season because she was just trying to completely kill the entire area. And the longer you can leave it on, the deeper the hot temperatures will get. What about the clematis, the one with the yellow flowers, usually climbing cottonwoods? I'm not sure that I'm familiar with exactly the plant you're talking about, but if you want to shoot me an email, that would be super helpful. So you never till a garden before you plant and don't add manure. What's your process? So I actually don't till really much anymore. We are planning to redo our garden in the next couple of years, and we will probably till at that point. Tilling is not as good for the soil in general, so I try to use a garden fork or something like a broad fork, just to kind of crack the garden soil so that you get a little bit more material. And I definitely would add manure. I would just add composted manure that has actually been out enough that it gets, or it's spent a few seasons composting so that the weed seeds are killed in it. I prefer to put in a compost than a straight manure. If you do add a straight manure, which you totally can, then you can put it in the fall with the expectation of planting the following spring. You don't want to use a straight manure right before you plant, just for food safety reasons. All right. Yes, and Eric just said we can send out the tools that I suggested with the handout as well. All right, somebody requesting information on macrophages and nematodes. Those are not things that I am terribly experienced with. My knowledge of phages in general is, I know they exist and I know that they have benefits, but I don't know enough about them to talk much. What about a mushroom compost? Mushroom compost can be really good. Definitely can be a really good source of organic material to put into your garden. All right. I've got a couple more minutes if we want to do any other questions, but otherwise, I will stop my screen share and thank you all so much. Question about, am I Canadian? My mother's actually British, so I say a few things weird. I get that question pretty often. Thank you all so much. It was wonderful to have everyone here, and I hope to see you again soon. We'll be back next week for gorgeous and tough perennials.